The story of Stephen Walter Cooke, known in prison yards and gang circles simply as Stainless, begins long before the headlines, the indictments, and the life sentence that would eventually seal his fate. To understand how he rose to become one of the most powerful figures in the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, ABT, you have to understand the violent ecosystem that shaped him. A world where race-based politics, militaristic hierarchy, and absolute obedience form the only law that matters. When Cooke entered the orbit of the ABT, he wasn't stepping into a traditional criminal gang. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas operates more like a paramilitary organization, lean, structured, and governed by a rigid chain of command that weaponizes loyalty. Members call it the family, but it functions more like a war machine with its own constitution, codes of conduct, and a ranking system resembling a battlefield command. Generals, captains, lieutenants, soldiers, prospects. Every position has rules, every rule has consequences, and every consequence is backed by force. In this world, Cooke thrived. He didn't simply join, he ascended. The moniker Stainless reflected the persona he cultivated among members. A man who moved clean, disciplined, untouched by fear or hesitation. His leadership style combined sharp organizational instincts with a ruthless willingness to enforce ABT doctrine, a combination that earned him rapid promotions. By the time he reached the rank of general, he wasn't just influential, he was feared. As a general, Cooke wielded one of the most dangerous powers within the organization, the authority to issue direct orders, known as DOS. These were not suggestions. A direct order was exactly what it sounded like, marching instructions from the top tier of command. And in the ABT, refusing a DO was equivalent to signing your own death certificate. The punishment for disobedience was swift, brutal, and unavoidable. Cooke understood this power intimately, and he used it to maintain ironclad control over the soldiers beneath him. But dominance in the ABT is never permanent. Power is fluid, respect is conditional, and violence is currency. Cooke navigated all of these realities with a steady, calculated hand. He monitored rival influences, enforced discipline with precision, and kept his soldiers aligned with his directives. Yet beneath the surface of the larger organization, fractures were forming. Fractures that would eventually shape the trajectory of Cooke's downfall. To outsiders, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas might seem unified under a common ideology, but the truth is far more unstable. The ABT has always been vulnerable to infighting, personality conflicts, and fractures driven by power-hungry leadership. These divisions breed tension, and tension breeds bloodshed. By the early 2000s, internal rivalries were intensifying, and Cooke found himself positioned at the center of several brewing disputes. The organization was splitting into factions, each jockeying for dominance, each distrustful of the others. And in a hierarchy built on paranoia and force, the smallest disagreement could escalate into fatal violence. As Cooke navigated these internal conflicts, he doubled down on maintaining order in his own ranks. His home in Tomball, Texas, became a kind of operational hub, a place where soldiers gathered, where infractions were discussed, and where discipline was often enforced. If a member violated the ABT's rules, punishment followed. And more often than not, that punishment came directly from Cooke's circle, executed under his watch, his directives, and in some cases, in his own home. This environment, where loyalty was mandatory, where consequences were lethal, and where power could shift overnight, shaped every decision Cooke made as a general. By the time law enforcement began paying serious attention to him, he was already deeply entrenched in the ABT's internal politics. He was respected by some, feared by many, and closely monitored by all who recognized his influence. But nothing prepared him or the organization for what came next. The murder of Scott Freeman in 2008 would become the breaking point that brought Cooke's world crashing down. A killing rooted in the ABT's factional divides, the homicide set off a chain reaction of investigations, indictments, and federal pressure that exposed cracks throughout the organization. Within those cracks, agents discovered other acts of violence. The brutal beating of a prospect, the illegal cache of firearms hidden in Cooke's residence, and a pattern of criminal activity that revealed the scope of his influence. Yet before the downfall, before the life sentence, before the courtroom testimonies and federal press conferences, there was the rise, the making of Stainless. A rise that speaks to something larger, the way prisons transform men, the way gangs weaponize identity, and the way an organization like the ABT turns individuals into instruments of its will. Cooke's ascent wasn't accidental. It was engineered through violence, discipline, and a code that demanded absolute loyalty. The forces that built him are the same forces now threatening to destroy him. What Cooke didn't yet realize was that one murder, one internal conflict that spiraled into deadly violence, would become the event that shifted everything. The Brotherhood was fracturing. Rival factions were sharpening their knives, and law enforcement was closing in. What happened next would change the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas forever. The murder of Scott Freeman in 2008 wasn't merely another act of gang violence. It was the culmination of a quiet war brewing inside the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. To understand why Freeman died, you have to understand the deep fractures threatening to tear the ABT apart from the inside out. And at the center of those fractures stood Stephen "Stainless" Cooke, a general whose authority was now challenged not only by law enforcement pressure, but by forces within his own organization. By the mid-2000s, the ABT was becoming increasingly unstable. What looked like unity on the outside concealed a maze of rivalries, old grudges and power struggles driven by ego and geography. Factions didn't always form around ideology. They formed around personalities, charismatic leaders, regional bosses, selected generals who built loyal followings. Cooke had his supporters, his loyalists, and his soldiers. So did Scott Freeman. Freeman wasn't an outsider. He was a fully embedded, long-time member of the ABT who had influence of his own. But as internal disagreements deepened, lines were drawn, and Freeman found himself aligned with a faction that stood in quiet opposition to Cooke's circle. In a system where authority is absolute, even subtle resistance can be deadly. Every meeting, every coded message, every decision carried political weight. And in the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, politics has always been written in blood. The tension didn't explode all at once. It built slowly over months, maybe years. Small acts of disobedience, disputes over orders, disagreements on discipline, or rumors of betrayal. In prison gangs, perception matters as much as reality. If a member appears disloyal, that perception can spread, shaping decisions at the highest ranks. Cooke was known for his strict enforcement of ABT rules, and Freeman's faction was increasingly seen as challenging that authority. By early 2008, whispers had become accusations, and accusations had become threats. Behind closed doors, ABT generals debated what to do with Freeman, whether he was a liability, whether he posed a risk to the structure of leadership. At some point, whether driven by fear, strategy, or ego, Cooke made his decision. A direct order needed to be carried out. Scott Freeman had to be removed. On the day of the murder in Liberty County, Texas, the air was thick with the tension that had been building for months. Freeman, at 37 years old, likely sensed that something was wrong. Rarely does a man involved deeply in prison politics fail to recognize the signs of an impending storm. But recognition doesn't always mean escape. Once the ABT marks someone for elimination, their fate is sealed long before the first blow lands. The killing itself was swift, violent, and deeply symbolic. It wasn't just about eliminating Freeman. It was about reinforcing control, sending a message, and restoring order within a fractured organization. In gang culture, the removal of a high-ranking or influential member sends ripples through every level of the structure. Soldiers take notice. Prospects take notice. Rivals take notice. And the general who issued the order reasserts his authority by proving that disobedience, or even perceived disobedience, is fatal. But the aftermath of Freeman's murder didn't unify the ABT. It destabilized it further. Some saw the killing as justified. Others viewed it as overreach. And within the organization's complex system of alliances, Cooke's decision deepened divides, pushing certain members closer together and driving others even further apart. Power is never steady in a gang built on paranoia, and every act of violence shifts the balance. For law enforcement, however, the killing was an opening, a crack in the wall. Freeman's homicide triggered a sequence of investigative steps that would eventually unravel Cooke's world thread by thread. Detectives, federal agents, and gang investigators began exploring the internal dynamics that led to the killing, interviewing informants, surveilling associates, and slowly piecing together the web of orders, communications, and motives behind the crime. What they found was a snapshot of the ABT's internal dysfunction. Factions turning against each other, leaders battling for loyalty, and a general, Cooke, whose influence was broader, deeper, and more violent than anyone outside the organization had previously understood. Every gang murder carries consequences, but this one was different. It wasn't a territorial dispute or a drug deal gone wrong. It was a political assassination inside a prison-based organization that prided itself on discipline. That made it unpredictable. That made it dangerous. And that made it something federal authorities could not ignore. As investigators dug deeper, more questions emerged. Why had Cooke aligned himself so firmly against Freeman's faction? Why did internal disagreements escalate to homicide? And what other acts of violence had been ordered under Cooke's command? The answers pointed toward a broader pattern of brutality, one that extended far beyond the killing in Liberty County. The Freeman murder set off a chain reaction. Witnesses began cooperating, former members revealed details of ABT operations, and detectives finally had a clearer path to unraveling Cooke's role as a general. As internal trust eroded within the Brotherhood, law enforcement gained an advantage it had never held before. By the time the dust settled, Scott Freeman was dead, the Brotherhood was divided, and Cooke had crossed a line from which there was no return. The murder didn't just mark Freeman for death, it marked Cooke for federal prosecution. The storm that had been building inside the ABT was now moving outward. The murder of Scott Freeman became the spark that ignited a full-scale federal offensive against Stephen "Stainless" Cooke. But what investigators uncovered in the months that followed revealed an even darker, more expansive pattern of violence, one that stretched far beyond a single internal assassination. Cooke's power wasn't theoretical. It wasn't symbolic. It was real, operational, and enforced through blood. And nowhere was that clearer than in the brutal beating of an ABT prospect and the discovery of a weapons cache in Cooke's own home. To understand the gravity of the 2008 aggravated assault case, you have to understand the culture Cooke enforced. The ABT is rigid. Rules are sacred. Violations are treated with a level of severity unmatched by most criminal organizations. Loyalty isn't suggested, it's demanded. And when a member or prospect fails to meet expectations, the discipline is swift and unforgiving. On September 22, 2008, that discipline unfolded inside Cooke's residence in Tomball, Texas. A prospective member had been summoned, not for a meeting, but for judgment. According to federal records, the prospect had broken ABT rules that Cooke had sworn to uphold. And in Cooke's world, failure to enforce those rules would be seen as weakness, an unforgivable flaw in the armor of a general. What happened next was a demonstration of ABT enforcement at its most ruthless. 12 ABT members, acting under direction, participated in the assault. This wasn't a spontaneous act of anger. It was a planned, orchestrated, and symbolic beating meant to send a message to everyone. Inside the Brotherhood, discipline comes through pain. And Cooke, as general, was the one who sanctioned that pain. The attack left the prospect severely injured. It also gave federal authorities a crucial insight into how Cooke operated. He didn't just issue orders. He supervised them. He allowed violence to occur under his roof. He created environments where loyalty was measured in brutality, where a man's worth was proven through his willingness to participate in group violence. It was ritualistic. It was calculated. It was the ABT at its purest form. This assault, along with the Freeman murder, painted a picture of Cooke as a leader who wielded violence not only as a weapon, but as a management tool. The ABT wasn't just a gang. Under generals like Cooke, it became a military structure where punishment was public, deliberate, and symbolic. Soldiers who participated proved their loyalty. Soldiers who refused faced consequences. And soldiers who disobeyed, they didn't last long enough to tell the story. As investigators dug deeper, Cooke's control over his environment became even more evident. In 2010, federal agents executed a search warrant at his Tomball residence. What they found was a stockpile more fitting for a militia than a gang leader. 7 rifles, 5 shotguns, over 300 rounds of ammunition, all hidden in the home of a man previously convicted of felony offenses. A man legally barred from possessing any firearms at all. The weapons cache was a revelation, one that confirmed what authorities already suspected. Cooke wasn't just a leader within the ABT. He was preparing for something bigger. Whether the weapons were intended for protection, retaliation, or future ABT operations, the message was unmistakable. Cooke was arming himself and his faction for whatever war might come next. Federal prosecutors wasted no time. The firearms case alone resulted in an 8-year federal sentence in 2010. But that was merely the beginning. Every charge brought forward, firearms possession, racketeering, aggravated assault, was a thread in a larger tapestry of organized violence. And as each thread was pulled, Cooke's empire unraveled. The problem for Cooke wasn't just that he had committed crimes, it was the pattern of those crimes, the consistency, the scale, and the leadership behind them. The federal government wasn't dealing with a low-level enforcer or a reckless soldier. They were dealing with a general, a man whose orders shaped the actions of others, a man whose influence extended across counties, across prisons, across every level of the Brotherhood. As federal investigators stitched together the timeline of Cooke's criminal activity, a clear narrative emerged. The Freeman murder wasn't an isolated incident. It was one piece of a violent, operational structure. The prospect beating wasn't random, it was systemic. The weapons cache wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Cooke's empire had been built on three pillars: fear, obedience, and violence. But once law enforcement penetrated those pillars, the entire structure collapsed. Former members began cooperating. Rival factions saw opportunity. And the ABT's internal instability became a weapon for federal prosecutors. The fall of Stainless was inevitable. By 2012, Cooke was no longer the feared general issuing orders from a position of power. He was a federal inmate facing life. His influence diminished, his authority hollow, his soldiers scattered. But even as the walls closed in, the impact of Cooke's leadership lingered. The violence he commanded, the orders he issued, and the fear he cultivated had reshaped the ABT. His fall wasn't just the end of a career, it was the beginning of a new era inside the Brotherhood. One where nothing would ever be the same again. By 2012, the violent legacy of Stephen "Stainless" Cooke had caught up with him. The rising general who once commanded soldiers, issued direct orders, and enforced discipline through violence, now found himself in a federal courtroom, facing the full weight of the justice system he had dodged for years. His fall was not sudden. It was the slow but inevitable collapse of a man whose power had been built on fear, brutality, and fractured loyalty. But when the end came, it came with the same finality that he once wielded against others. On May 3, 2012, Cooke received the sentence that would define the rest of his life. Life in federal prison for the murder of Scott Freeman. It was the centerpiece of the government's case, the act that had opened the door for investigators, and the crime that exposed the internal chaos of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. The courtroom was filled with the tension of a saga that had spanned years. Rival factions, bloody discipline, illegal weapons, and a killing that fractured the ABT from the inside. The judge's words were a form of closure for law enforcement, but for the Brotherhood, the moment represented something far more complex. When a general falls, the reverberations are felt through every tier of the organization. Soldiers analyze the shift in power, sub-commanders jockey for position, and rival factions see opportunity. Cooke's life sentence didn't dismantle the ABT, but it created a vacuum. And in the world of prison gangs, a vacuum is always dangerous. In addition to his life sentence, Cooke also faced an additional 87-month sentence for the racketeering aggravated assault, the brutal beating of the ABT prospect conducted in his own home. Though served concurrently with his life term, the charge reinforced the evidence of Cooke's leadership role in orchestrating violence. And that wasn't all. His earlier firearms conviction from 2010, 96 months for being a felon in possession of 7 rifles, 5 shotguns, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, added yet another layer to the complex web of his criminal history. To federal prosecutors, Cooke was the embodiment of ABT leadership at its most dangerous. Structured, disciplined, violent, and deeply connected. Taking him off the streets wasn't merely a matter of punishment. It was an attempt to disrupt an organization that used hierarchy and brutality as its foundation. But as history has shown time and again, dismantling a single leader rarely topples an entire gang. Inside the federal prison system, Cooke became one of many high-ranking ABT members serving life sentences. His influence was effectively neutralized, but the Brotherhood itself continued operating, adapting, and evolving. The ABT, unlike more centralized organizations, has the ability to survive the loss of multiple leaders by decentralizing power. Generals fall, captains rise, soldiers shift loyalties, and the cycle continues. Cooke's downfall, however, did force the organization to re-examine its internal structures. His leadership style, strict, militaristic, and grounded in harsh enforcement, had defined his faction. With him gone, the power balance shifted, allowing rival leaders to reshape operations. Some factions became more cautious, others doubled down on violence, but all of them carried the knowledge of what Cooke's fate represented. No general is untouchable. For law enforcement, Cooke's conviction was a victory, but also a sobering reminder of the limitations of federal intervention. Removing a general weakens the organizational chain, but it doesn't sever it. The ABT's network reaches across state prisons, county jails, and federal institutions. Communication flows through coded letters, smuggled phones, corrupt insiders, and long-standing personal connections. The gang's operations, extortion, drug trafficking, assaults, and internal discipline did not end with Cooke's imprisonment. They simply changed hands. Still, there was symbolic significance in Cooke's sentencing. A man once feared by soldiers, respected by enforcers, and obeyed by subordinates now spent his days behind bars with no path to freedom. The same system he once manipulated and operated within was now the system that defined every second of his existence. His title of general no longer held real weight. His influence, once formidable, had dissolved into the broader hierarchy of federal inmates. Yet Cooke's story is not just about punishment. It is about the nature of power inside criminal organizations. His rise showed how the ABT molds men into leaders through violence and loyalty. His fall showed how easily those same forces can turn inward, consuming the very individuals who once commanded them. And his life sentence stands as a testament to the relentless cycle of gang leadership: the rise, the reign, the fracture, the destruction. In the end, Stephen "Stainless" Cooke became another chapter in the ABT's evolving history. His decisions reshaped the Brotherhood's internal landscape. His downfall shifted its power structure. His crimes sealed his fate. And his story reveals the truth at the heart of every prison gang. Leaders come and go, but the organization persists. Cooke will spend the remainder of his life behind walls he once ruled from. The ABT will continue on, shaped by new generals, new conflicts, and new betrayals. But the legacy Cooke left behind, the violence he ordered, the factions he fueled, and the chain of events he set in motion, will echo through the Brotherhood for years to come.